Before Edinburgh was a city, it was a rock, a volcanic plug rising from the flat land of the Lothians, visible for miles in every direction, impossible to ignore and almost impossible to take. For 3,000 years, whoever held that rock held this part of Scotland. The story of Edinburgh begins not with cobblestones or cathedrals or Georgian terraces. It begins with a hill fort on a cliff, a poem about warriors who rode out and never came back, and a name that nobody fully understands anymore. This video uses AI tools to visually reconstruct how Edinburgh looked across these centuries. The results are not always perfect, but every fact has been carefully researched. The people who built the first fortress on Castle Rock were called the Votadini by the Romans. By the time they appear in their own stories, they called themselves the Gododin, and their fortress had a name, Din Eidyn. The Fort of Eidyn. What Eidyn meant, nobody knows. The word predates every language that survived to record it. Around the year 600, a bard named Aneurin composed one of the oldest surviving poems in any British language. It describes 300 warriors assembling at Din Eidyn, feasting for a year in the Great Hall on the rock, preparing for war. They rode south to fight the Angles at Catraeth. Almost all of them were killed. The poem mourns them. It does not record what happened to the fortress they left behind. In 638, the Angles of Bernicia laid siege to Din Eidyn and took it. They kept the name, replacing the Brittonic word for fortress with their own word, Bur. Din Eidyn became Edinburgh. The rock changed hands, but the name stuck, carrying within it the ghost of the people who had been there first. For 3 centuries, Edinburgh was Anglian, part of the Kingdom of Northumbria, a fortress on its northern frontier. Around 960, a king named Indulf brought Edinburgh under Scottish control. The long memory of Din Eidyn had not been forgotten. Edinburgh was home again. But it was still only a rock with a fortress. What turned it into a city was a king. In 1124, David I became King of Scots. He had grown up at the Norman court of England, absorbed its methods, its architecture, its ambitions, and when he came home, he brought all of it with him. He began on the rock. He built a small stone chapel inside the castle walls, dedicated to his mother, Margaret, who had died there in 1093. It still stands today, and the oldest building in Edinburgh, the oldest building in any Scottish castle. Everything else from that century has been destroyed or rebuilt. That one small chapel survived everything. Then he looked east, along the ridge. A mile from the castle, at the foot of a great volcanic cliff, he founded an abbey. The legend says he was hunting when a white stag appeared, and between its antlers was a holy cross that saved his life. Whether the vision was real or not, the abbey was. David founded Holyrood Abbey in 1128. The ridge connecting the castle to the abbey became the spine of a new city. Before 1127, the first surviving charter refers to my burgh of Edinburgh. A royal burgh could hold markets, regulate trade, collect tolls. Edinburgh now had a reason to exist beyond its fortress. Merchants arrived, craftsmen arrived, houses pressed together along the ridge. The Canongate became its own separate burgh, governed by the monks of Holyrood. St. Giles stood in the middle. Within a generation, Edinburgh had a castle at one end, an abbey at the other, a market street connecting them, and a parish church in the centre. The bones of the old town were in place. They have never fundamentally changed. In March 1296, Edward I marched north. He had spent years manipulating Scotland's succession crisis, installing a king of his choosing. When that king, John Balliol, defied him by allying with France, Edward invaded. He sacked Berwick. He seized the Stone of Destiny from Scone. He marched on Edinburgh Castle and took it in 3 days of bombardment. Scotland, as far as Edward was concerned, was conquered. It was not. William Wallace and Andrew Murray led a revolt that swept through Scotland. In September 1297, they destroyed an English army at Stirling Bridge. Wallace became Guardian of Scotland. He was defeated at Falkirk, resigned, and continued to resist as a fugitive until his capture and execution in London in 1305. In 1306, Robert Bruce seized the Scottish throne and began again. For 8 years he fought, losing battles, hiding on islands, watching his family imprisoned. Steadily he ground the English down. At Bannockburn, on the 23rd and 24th of June 1314, Bruce destroyed the English army sent to relieve Stirling Castle. But Edinburgh had fallen earlier in a night raid. 30 men, led by Thomas Randolph, scaled the sheer north face of Castle Rock in darkness, surprised the garrison and took it back. Bruce demolished the castle immediately. He would not leave the English a fortress to return to. Only St. Margaret's Chapel was spared. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, signed on the 1st of May 1328, ended the war. England recognised Robert Bruce as King of Scots. Bruce signed the treaty at Holyrood Abbey. The same rock, the same ridge, but free. The wars were over. Through the 15th century, Edinburgh became unmistakably the capital of Scotland, not by declaration, but by accumulation. The royal court settled here, Parliament met here, the Royal Mile filled with tall sandstone tenements, the closes pressing tight, the city climbing skyward because it had nowhere else to go. And then came Flodden. On the 9th of September 1513, James IV led an army south into England to honour the Auld Alliance. The English army under the Earl of Surrey manoeuvred around the Scottish position and caught them on unfavourable ground. Bills cut through pikes. James charged personally into the melee. He was found among his fallen bodyguard, 2 arrow wounds, multiple blade injuries. He was the last reigning monarch in Britain to die in battle. More than 10,000 Scots died at Flodden. The entire generation of nobility was gone in a single afternoon. Edinburgh heard the news and built a wall. The Flodden Wall, raised in months, ringed the city in grief and practicality. It still defines the boundary of the medieval Old Town. What followed was half a century of minority kingships and factional violence. And through the middle of it came something more permanent than any battle, the Reformation. John Knox preached at St. Giles Cathedral in 1559. The Catholic regent Mary of Guise held Edinburgh Castle and Leith with French troops. The Protestant lords of the congregation called on England for help. An English fleet blockaded the Firth of Forth. Mary of Guise died in June 1560. Without her, the French position collapsed. In August 1560, the Reformation Parliament abolished papal authority in Scotland. The Mass was outlawed. The old church was gone. Edinburgh had been a fortress for 1,000 years. Now it was a Protestant capital, tense with new convictions, looking toward a future nobody could yet see clearly. On the 5th of April, 1603, James VI of Scotland rode out of Edinburgh and turned south toward London. He had just inherited the English throne. Before he left, he stood at the High Kirk of St. Giles on the Royal Mile and swore to his people he would return every 3 years. He never kept that promise. He came back once, in 1617, and never again. Scotland had lost its king to England without a single battle. Edinburgh fell quiet in a way it never had before. The court was gone, the poets were gone, the money and the noise and the gravitational pull of royalty, all of it gone south. The city still had its law courts, its university, its kirk, but the heart had been removed. Then Charles I made things worse. He tried to impose an English-style prayer book on the Scottish Church. In July 1637, a woman named Jenny Geddes, or so the legend goes, threw her stool at the preacher in St. Giles and started a riot. The city erupted. Within months, Scotland was organising its resistance. On the 28th of February 1638, thousands of Scots gathered at Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh and signed the National Covenant, a declaration that their church answered to God alone, not to the king. Nobles, ministers and ordinary citizens signed it. It was an act of defiance that would trigger civil war across Britain, contribute to the execution of a king, and make Edinburgh the centre of a religious revolution that reshaped the country permanently. But the fight cost everything. By 1707, Scotland was financially broken. The disastrous Darien scheme had wiped out a quarter of the country's liquid wealth in a failed attempt to establish a Scottish colony in Central America. The English offered a financial lifeline in exchange for political union. The Scottish Parliament voted to dissolve itself. On the streets of Edinburgh, the reaction was fury. Mobs filled the Royal Mile. The writer Daniel Defoe, working as a spy for the London government, reported crowds shouting English dogs and no union on the high street. Troops surrounded the Parliament building as the final vote was taken. Scotland ceased to exist as an independent state, not by conquest but by a vote that most of its people never wanted. Scotland had lost its Parliament, but it had not lost its memory. The Union had not extinguished the old loyalties. The exiled House of Stuart still had its followers, the Jacobites, and in 1715 a group of them tried to take Edinburgh Castle by climbing the rock at night, exactly as Robert the Bruce's men had done 4 centuries earlier. They were betrayed before they reached the top. The attempt failed, but the fire was still burning. 30 years later, it came back brighter than ever. In September 1745, a young man entered Edinburgh on horseback. He was 24 years old, dressed in Highland tartan, and his name was Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie. The city gates opened without a fight. The Jacobite army walked in unopposed. He established his court at Holyrood Palace, 200 metres from Edinburgh Castle. The castle remained in government hands throughout. For 6 weeks, 2 Scotlands existed side by side on the same street, one holding Jacobite balls in the palace, the other watching from behind government walls on the rock. Edinburgh cooperated just enough to avoid destruction and never fully committed to the cause. Then Charles marched south into England. He reached Derby, 150 miles from London, and then his counsel failed him and he turned back. By April 1746, the Jacobite army was starving and exhausted on a flat moor outside Inverness called Culloden. The government forces under the Duke of Cumberland opened fire. The battle lasted less than an hour. Around 2,000 Jacobites were killed or wounded. The rest fled. What followed was methodical destruction. Highland dress was banned. The clan system was dismantled by law. Estates were seized. An entire way of life, thousands of years old, was erased within a generation. Edinburgh watched from a distance and began to reinvent itself. If you want to help this channel keep telling stories like this one, stories that no textbook bothers with, you can join as a member. It directly supports the research, the production, and the next reconstruction. By the mid-18th century, Edinburgh was one of the most overcrowded cities in Europe. 11-storey tenements lined the Royal Mile, nobles and beggars sharing the same stairwells. The city had no room to grow, hemmed in by the Castle Rock to the west and the Norloch to the north. Visitors described it as magnificent and revolting in equal measure. In 1766, the city held a competition to design a solution. The winner was a 27-year-old architect named James Craig. His plan was radical in its simplicity: a grid of wide streets, elegant squares, and open gardens on the drained land north of the Norloch. George Street as the spine, Princes Street and Queen Street on either side, Charlotte Square to the west, St Andrew Square to the east. Those who could afford it left the old town almost overnight. Within a generation, the most elegant address in Edinburgh was also the newest. The medieval city, where Mary Queen of Scots had walked, where the Covenanters had plotted, where 10 families shared a single stairwell, became invisible to the people who now governed it. Edinburgh had become 2 cities sharing one name. On one side of the valley, the Georgian order of the new town. On the other, the medieval darkness of the old. And somewhere in that darkness, a man named Deacon Brodie. He was a respected city councillor and cabinet maker by day. By night, he used the keys from his clients' homes to burgle them. When he was finally caught and hanged in 1788, he left behind something more than a scandal. He left behind the idea of a man divided against himself, an idea that would haunt a young Edinburgh writer for the rest of his life. And then something extraordinary happened in those Georgian drawing rooms and university lecture halls. Scotland, a country that had lost its parliament, watched its Highland culture destroyed and dissolved itself into a larger union, decided to think its way back to greatness. David Hume was walking these streets, rewriting the foundations of human knowledge. Adam Smith was working out how economies actually function. His Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, would reshape the world. The first Encyclopaedia Britannica was conceived, written and printed in Edinburgh between 1768 and 1771. A city that had been politically humiliated became the intellectual capital of Europe. Visitors called it a hotbed of genius. The nickname Athens of the North was not flattery, it was recognition. But Edinburgh never lost its shadows. In 1828, two men named William Burke and William Hare discovered that the medical school on Surgeons Square would pay well for fresh corpses. Rather than waiting for people to die, they began killing their lodgers, 16 murders in less than a year before they were caught. Hare turned on Burke to save himself. Burke was hanged in January 1829 before a crowd of 25,000 people. His skeleton is still on display in the medical school today. The same city that produced Hume and Smith also produced Burke and Hare. The same closes that sheltered genius also sheltered murder. Edinburgh had always contained its own opposite, and now, on the edge of a new century, it was about to be tested in ways none of its philosophers had predicted. Robert Louis Stevenson was born in Edinburgh on the 13th of November 1850 into a prosperous Newtown family on Heriot Row. He grew up in the elegant Georgian order of the North Side, wide streets, high ceilings, gas lamps. But the old town was always visible from his windows, across the valley. Dark, vertical, medieval, full of lives he was not supposed to know about. He knew about them anyway. The closes of the old town were among the most overcrowded places in Britain. Entire families in single rooms, no running water, disease moving through the tenements like weather. In 1862, Henry Littlejohn became Edinburgh's first medical officer of health. His report, published 3 years later, documented the conditions in over 1,000 streets, closes and tenements. It demonstrated with merciless precision the direct link between poverty, overcrowding and death. Stevenson walked those closes. He watched the city from both sides of the valley. And in 1886, he published a short novel that captured the city's essential truth, a man of perfect respectability who contained within himself something monstrous. The strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was set in London, but everyone who knew Edinburgh understood where it really came from. 9 years after Stevenson, another boy was born into Edinburgh, Arthur Conan Doyle, in 1859, into a much harder family life on Piccadilly Place. He studied medicine at the University of Edinburgh, where he encountered a professor named Joseph Bell. Bell could look at a patient who had just walked through the door and deduce their profession, their recent travels, their habits, from the calluses on their hands, the mud on their boots, the cut of their coat. The students were astonished. One of them never forgot it. After the first Sherlock Holmes story appeared in 1886, the resemblance to Bell was so obvious that Stevenson, by then living in Samoa, wrote to Doyle from across the world, "Can this be my old friend Joe Bell?" Edinburgh had given the world the greatest detective in fiction. It had done so by accident in a medical lecture hall because one doctor was unusually good at looking. In 1914, Edinburgh sent its sons to war. A charismatic figure named George McCrae led a recruitment drive so effective that 16 players from Heart of Midlothian Football Club enlisted together, along with 500 supporters, what became known as McCrae's Battalion. 7 of those first team players were killed in action. In 1916, a German Zeppelin appeared over the city and dropped its bombs. 13 people were killed, 24 injured. It was Edinburgh's first experience of being a target from the sky. But the strangest and most haunting story of Edinburgh's war years happened not on a battlefield, but in a hospital on the city's southern edge. At Craiglockhart, a psychiatric facility, the army sent its shell-shocked officers to recover. In 1917, 2 men arrived who happened to be poets. Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon met at Craiglockhart and wrote some of their greatest work about the war, not to celebrate it, but to bear witness to what it had done to men. Owen returned to the front and was killed on the 4th of November 1918, 7 days before the armistice. The Scottish National War Memorial, completed in Edinburgh Castle in 1927, records the names of nearly 135,000 Scottish dead from that war alone. The Second War was different for Edinburgh. The city was not bombed on the scale of London or Clydebank, but on the 16th of October 1939, the first air battle over British skies in the Second World War took place directly above the Firth of Forth. Spitfires, intercepting German bombers targeting a naval vessel. 16 sailors died. Edinburgh's children were evacuated to the countryside. The castle became a military headquarters the city held. If this channel has ever brought a piece of history to life for you, consider joining as a member. It helps fund the research, the production, and the next reconstruction. The link is in the description. In August 1947, with Europe still in ruins and rationing still in force, Edinburgh did something unexpected. It opened its doors to the world and invited everyone in. The idea had been born 5 years earlier when Rudolf Bing, the Austrian impresario who ran the Glyndebourne Opera, was walking down Princes Street one evening during the war and looked up at the castle. The thought lodged itself and refused to leave. When peace came, he made it happen. The founding vision was simple: to reunite people through great art after the devastation of war. There was one problem. The Minister for Fuel and Power had banned floodlighting the castle. Rationing was still in force. The people of Edinburgh disagreed. Hundreds of letters and telegrams arrived at the ministry offering to donate their private coal rations so that the castle could be seen, floodlit at night, for the visitors. The minister relented. Edinburgh Castle was illuminated from the city's own rations for 4 nights, from dusk to midnight. 8 theatre companies who had not been invited to the official festival showed up anyway and performed in church halls and small venues across the city. Nobody had organised them. They just arrived. In 1948, a journalist watching them described the activity happening around the fringes of the official programme. The word stuck. The Edinburgh Festival Fringe was born without anyone planning it, which is perhaps the most Edinburgh thing that has ever happened. Today, the Fringe brings millions of visits to Edinburgh every August. The city that was once called filthy, overcrowded and desperate had become the cultural capital of the world for 3 weeks every year. For nearly 3 centuries, Scotland had governed itself through Westminster. The Scottish Parliament, dissolved in 1707, had never reconvened. But in September 1997, Scotland voted in a referendum. Nearly 3/4 voted in favour of establishing a Scottish Parliament. On the 1st of July 1999, the Scottish Parliament reconvened in Edinburgh for the first time since 1707. 292 years. The opening ceremony took place in the General Assembly Hall on the Mound. Edinburgh was a capital again, in the full sense of the word. The permanent home took longer. The new Scottish Parliament building at the foot of the Royal Mile, designed by the Catalan architect Enric Miralles, cost £414 million, 10 times the original estimate. It opened in 2004. Critics attacked the cost and the delay. But the building itself, its strange organic shapes, its references to Scottish landscape and upturned boats, was recognised as a work of architecture unlike anything else in the city. In 1995, the Old Town and New Town of Edinburgh had been jointly designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. 2 cities on one ridge, medieval and Georgian, dark and pale, cramped and ordered, recognised together as something the world needed to protect. Edinburgh today is home to around 550,000 people. It faces the same tensions it has always faced: wealth and poverty on the same street, global ambition and fierce local identity, a past so heavy it could crush you, and a present that refuses to be defined by it. The question of Scottish independence, sharpened by the 2014 referendum, in which Scotland voted 55 to 45 to remain in the United Kingdom, remains open. From the volcanic rock that the Gododin called Din Eidyn to the Parliament at the foot of the Royal Mile, Edinburgh has never stopped arguing about what it is and who it belongs to. That argument is the city.